Evolutionary Theory and Psychology, Precursors to Darwinian Theory. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spirit glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. Those, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. Written by Erasmus Darwin, the poem is called The Temple of Nature, published in 1802 in his book Xenomia. There are actually several other stanzas to this poem, which you're probably reading as could be early Dr. Seuss. Actually, it's got quite a bit right in terms of evolutionary ideas. Organic life beneath the shoreless wave. Everyone's pretty certain that the first life on this planet was in the water, in some pool of water or some slimy water someplace. I don't know about nursing in pearly caves, but the first forms of life on our planet were minute, too small to be seen by a microscope, which has spirit glass. Ultimately, you get the great diversity that we have of life on our planet, and life has gotten more sophisticated with new powers. Animals have gotten bigger, including us. Then you get countless numbers of species of plants and fish and things that walk around on feet and things that fly with wings. 1802, not bad. Raz was Charles Darwin's grandfather. He was also Francis Galton's grandfather. However, he never met Charles because he passed away long before Charles was born. So his grandfather is thinking about evolution. By the time Raz comes along, the Darwins had established themselves as a wealthy upper crust English family. Although Raz earned a medical doctorate, he made most of his money through farming his estates, as did the other Darwins, including Charles later. He took up medicine and started to look at life and where it came from. He studied primarily plants. Being a gentleman farmer, he looked at the idea of hybrid plants and thought that hybrid plants gave you the possibility to develop new species. He also believed that existing life forms had evolved from earlier species. Now, this is an important point. Where do new species come from? This was one of the very early questions that evolutionary thinkers had to answer. And Raz kind of nailed it. He went astray on some points. He ascribed evolutionary development to the organism's conscious adaptation to the needs and environment. He thought the organism wanted to change, wanted to evolve. And this is probably influenced by Lamarckian theory, which was around in Raz's day. He did believe that cross-fertilization of plants was superior to reproduction by self-fertilization, as it encouraged diversity in the next generation of plants. And one of the things that any good evolutionary theorist will tell you is that diversity is the basic thing you need to have evolution work. So he was pretty correct there. He got other things wrong. He thought insectivorous plants had muscles, nerves, brains. He came to those conclusions because he studied Venus flytraps. If you aren't aware of what a Venus flytrap is, but you've ever seen the movie Little Shop of Horrors, well, Audrey 2 is just an overgrown Venus flytrap. Set on destroying the world, but then that's the video in the movie. So let's talk about a couple of other precursors to Darwinian thinking. This one came later, actually, after Darwin published Origin of Species. Patrick Matthew contacted him and said, "Hey, your idea isn't original. It's in the back of my book here in an appendix on naval timber and arboriculture." And sure enough, Mr. Matthew laid out the basics of natural selection in his book. And I'll let you read Darwin's statements there where he acknowledges this over these two slides. Matthew had discovered this independently of any work other people were doing, thought it was important, but not important enough to put any place but an appendix. So he becomes a footnote in history, but it was good that Darwin acknowledged his predecessor. It only shows you that the idea of evolutionary processes by natural selection was kind of floating out there. It took a bit for Darwin to come up with it. We'll also talk about Wallace's independent finding of natural selection in the next video. So Matthew, I put as a precursor, but nobody knew about his appendix until after Origins was published, so maybe he's a post-cursor. After he found out he didn't make a big deal of this theory, he probably just was a plain cursor, period. Sorry, bad joke. Okay, Herbert Spencer, someone I like to curse about. Spencer starts out as a Lamarckian. Once Darwin publishes Origin of the Species, he turns himself into a rabid Darwinian. He comes up with a couple of ideas that aren't so great. First of all, he coins the term survival of the fittest. Darwin didn't come up with it, it's a Spencer term. That's okay. Survival of the fittest is kind of an adequate thing to explain evolutionary principles in part. Where I have a bone of contention with Herbert Spencer is Herbert Spencer said two things that are just flat wrong. First, he was an avowed social Darwinist. Darwin was never a social Darwinist. Social Darwinism is the idea that some people are more evolved than other people. Hence, they should be in charge of all the other humans. I find this idea particularly reprehensible. There isn't any one person that's more evolved than other people. You can look in your science fiction literature, maybe find that, but in reality, no. There are no more evolved people than others out there. A lot of folks liked his ideas of social Darwinism because they gave justification for anything from Marxian communism, that a society under communism would be more evolved than others, or the robber barons in the United States of the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, those folks who thought they were more evolved than their workers. In fact, folks like Carnegie felt that if it wasn't for him building his steel mills and factories, all these lesser people who worked in them wouldn't have a job. So it was okay to accumulate and have all this wealth. Now, the other idea that is just plain wrong that Spencer tries to tout is the idea that evolution leads to perfectionism. This one's just flat wrong. Evolution does not lead to perfectionism. Evolution is simply change and adaptation to the current environment. If the current environment changes, then that adaptation may not be good anymore and might have to change again. There's lots of reasons why evolution doesn't lead to perfectionism that are way beyond the scope of what we're talking about in this short segment on evolution. But get the idea that just because something's evolved, it's better than other things. And individuals in the private sector do this all the time, trying to say that the current evolution of their product is so much better than the old model. That's just wrong. Evolution simply change. Well, we need a couple of other things for evolution to happen. These guys were some of our intellectual precursors. Thomas Robert Malthus, who you most likely have heard of before, comes up with the profound idea based out of economics that populations increase geometrically. However, at its best, food supplies may only increase arithmetically. Well, unless you artificially control a population, the population will quickly grow over many generations and exceed the food supply, which is not under any situation going to be a good thing because there's not going to be enough food for everyone who needs it. And Malthus was primarily using this example to talk about humans. So Malthus then says, well, natural factors come into play. You're going to find the population of the less privileged, his words, to be prone to famine and disease, will have high mortality rates and help the population not outstrip its food supply. Well, Darwin gets a hold of Malthus, reads his essay, and realizes that high infant mortality rates may actually negate the geometric increase in members of species in a population. In most species, you do find high infant mortality rates. In our species, we've done extraordinary things, as we should, for the survival of infants. But this is a relatively new thing. In my grandmother's generation, there were high infant mortality rates. Families were very large, not because people wanted really big families, but there was also the assumption that you have to have as many kids as possible because, well, some of them just might not make it to adulthood. Kind of tragic, but true. And if there's not enough food, if there aren't enough resources, what's going to happen? Some people are going to die. The most vulnerable individuals in any population are the infants. And that's what Darwin noticed. He further deduced that the survivors are on average better suited to survive in their environment. This is where he termed this process of selection through what he called natural causes, natural selection. And what Malthus was looking at was the extremely poor sections of English Victorian era, this would be a little pre-Victorian era, poor. They didn't have access to medicine. They didn't have good food. They didn't have good water. Lot of mortality with the less privileged in English society. It's not just people that suffer from this. Let me give you an example that's currently quite a troubling one. In New York City, right now there are more rats than people. The rat population is growing geometrically, and several years ago outstripped the human population. It's a major problem for well-being and health in New York City. And what's happening is a lot of the rat pups that are born into situations where they can't get food, warmth, their needs taken care of are dying out. Those rat pups that get really good care from their mothers and are well fed will survive better. So it doesn't have to be people using this example. It can be any species. Don't like to think about the rats in New York City, but big issue. Now, that was only one thing that Darwin needed. So he's got the natural selection process figured out. But he needs one thing for it to work, and that's time. He needed, as the Rolling Stones say, time on his side. Sir Charles Lyell, one of Darwin's mentors and later friends, solved this for him indirectly. Lyell was a geologist. He published the primary book on geology in his time, Principles of Geology. And the biggest thing that Lyell's book did was deal a death blow to the Catastrophic school of geology. Now, here's the Catastrophic school of geology. It's basically the idea of the flood. If you take back all of the begats in the Bible from the last folks in the New Testament to the first folks, Adam and Eve, that are mentioned in the Bible, and you add all their lifespans up and you backtrack things, you come to the conclusion that our planet is approximately 6,000 years old. And that the Great Flood happened about 2,500 years before the Common Era. Not enough time for evolution to work. Lyell demonstrated that the Earth was far older than any previous scientist had speculated. In fact, it seems like about every month or so, I hear a news report saying that the Earth is older than previous estimates. Still going on. But Lyell established a scientific theory of geology free of supernatural intervention. He also established some scientific methods for studying geology using advances in paleontology, particularly the study of seashells, both at the seashore, sorry, had to do that one, and up in the mountains. It had previously been believed when a geologist found a seashell or a sea fossil up in the mountains that it was a result of the Great Flood. Lyell was able to show it was due to the movement of the tectonic plates of the earth. The things that were at once underwater are now several thousand feet high because the plates have pushed the former seabeds into the sides of mountains. So Darwin's now got two things going for him. He's got Malthus's idea on population. He's got Lyell's ideas on time. In our next unit, we'll put this all together, talk about another person who's important to our story, Alfred Russel Wallace, and move on with evolutionary theory. We'll see you next time. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.